Good afternoon, everybody. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are streaming today from many places all over the country, and I pay my respects to your ancestors, to your elders, to your young people, your future leaders, and your traditional owners on the country that you're all watching from today. So, welcome. Dalgaya, my name is Raquel Kerr. I am a Jurong traditional owner, and I'm also appointed to the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. I would like to acknowledge a lot of people who are present today in making this happen, and to my fans in the empty auditorium that are sitting here right now. I have like 2 people in this room who aren't doing anything, so thank you. But a huge hello to everybody who is watching from home, in the comfort of their lounge rooms with all their snacks. I envy you immensely. So, I would like to welcome you again to today's discussion on how we can do better to care for our country. Caring for our country is something that traditional owners all across the world take very, very seriously. We do this through a variety of ways. We do this through managing Aboriginal cultural heritage. We do this through managing environment. We use this by, reaching out and doing further education across many social, economic status backgrounds. A bit of background about myself before we get stuck into it. I've had a variety of roles across a 10-year span in the Aboriginal cultural heritage industry. Started off as a field worker, working with archaeologists, eventually moved to managing and helping negotiate for cultural heritage management plans, and then more recently appointed to the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, which works more towards helping traditional owners in self-determination so they can manage their own cultural heritage. I think one of the important questions today to keep in mind while you are watching is, how is legislation important in helping care for our country, and how can we do better? This afternoon, we as traditional owners and non-traditional owners who are tuning in today will be discussing why it is important to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage, and why is it important to visit the existing legislation that stands in Victoria today. Don't mind me, I'm just going to flip my paper. All right. Particularly, the discussion today will focus on Australian legislation, the differences between that, and obviously focusing on Victorian legislation and how it protects cultural heritage today. For a lot of people who have tuned in today, you may not know what type of legislation it is, and I will give you a very quick rundown as to how it works. So in 2006, 2007, the introduction of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act came into play. The point of this was to give traditional owners a mechanism through law to manage Aboriginal cultural heritage on country, to make decisions on how it was going to be managed and to protect. This is done through a form of recognition as a registered Aboriginal party. The registered Aboriginal party is approved by the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council and met a series of criteria in being able to prove not only placement of their identity, but their ability and their knowledge, their cultural knowledge, in being able to manage cultural heritage. Without further ado, I would also like to welcome our panel speakers who are going to be appearing behind me this afternoon. So today we have Rodney Carter, Rachel Perkins, Hans Buckland, and Jamie Lowe. So to start this afternoon, I would like to call on this screen right here, Rodney Carter, who is the chairperson of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, the Chief Executive Officer of Jurong Clans Aboriginal Corporation, who is a registered party in Central Victoria, and also part of Jurong Enterprises Limited. So welcome, Rodney. Can we hear you?
Can
Try
you hear
again.
me now?
Yes,
Welcome,
fantastic.
everyone. Sorry about that technical glitch. Thanks a lot, Raquel, for the introduction. So Benjen and Jandak Victoria Gundich. I'm really honoured to be able to be speaking to you today from my homelands of the Jurong people of Central Victoria, and I'm very honoured also, I think, to be a Victorian and to call this place my home. I think Victoria has got a long way to go, but it's done some amazing and significant achievements as people and through legislation. So I want to acknowledge my ancestors and always turn my thinking and suggest to others that they do it also, that their lives were not as fortunate as our lives today. So let's just briefly think about our ancestors always. So the protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage in Victoria has only been necessitated since the intrusion on our country. And for us as First People, that really was about the invasion of our homelands. Across Australia, the 1993 Federal Native Title Act offered a statutory acknowledgement of ownership that was only limited in its approach to the connection to country. So the council was formed amid the land justice fight and our people's struggles around federal native title determinations, particularly the idea that the tide of history had washed away and thereby extinguished those rights, and in some instances, if it was extremely significant. At the time, the Victorian government supported the land justice movement through the implementation of two pieces of landmark legislation. And Raquel just mentioned one, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act of 2006. And then shortly after, we were fortunate to have the Traditional Owner Settlement Act of 2010. As we reflect on 13 years of implementation of the Aboriginal Heritage Act in Victoria, I'm extremely proud of the strength of our cultures and the many ways Victorian traditional owners express and promote their cultural values. The health and well-being of our communities is underpinned by strong culture and a strong sense of connection with it. In 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the significant Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, supporting the survival, dignity and well-being of our people. The Declaration is the foundation of Council's work. The Aboriginal Heritage Act and Declaration together provide some of the greatest protections for traditional owners in the country. However, there is still much to be done in realising a fundamentally self-determined and tangible ownership of our culture, heritage, history and country. Our vision is for it to be the best in the world. To ensure traditional owners have the requisite regulatory support to protect the oldest living culture on earth, the Council is now undertaking a review of the Act. Council has developed a discussion paper, Taking Control of Our Heritage, to consider key sections of the Act that need strengthening to enshrine both self-determination and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Victorian Aboriginal cultural heritage legislation. The objective of the paper is to help everyone, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, Victorian and non-Victorian, have their say on the operation of the Act. In Victoria, we have good protections within the Act. However, all aspects of our living, working and regulatory environments could more thoroughly incorporate the rights of Indigenous peoples. Our legislation developed and implemented to ensure traditional owners not only manage, but have control of their cultural heritage country, should enshrine to the rights to self-determination, not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture, practice and revitalise their cultural traditions and customs, manifest, practice, develop and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs and ceremonies, maintain, protect and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, to use and control of their ceremonial objects, the repatriation of their human remains, our ancestors' remains, our family before us, designate and retain their own names for communities, places and person, participate in decision-making through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures as well as their own decision-making institutions, maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationships with their traditionally owned lands, territories, waters, coastal seas and other resources, main control, protect, develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, the manifestations of their sciences, technologies and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicine, knowledge of the properties of flora and fauna, oral tradition, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games and visual and performing arts. To respect us and our rights is to respect yourself and what we would want for all Australians and our children to inherit from the work that we do today. We all have a part to play in ensuring recognition of our people's right to self-determination, our culture and country. We seek the support and contributions of everyone to work with us, ensuring that the statutory protections our peoples have for their culture is commensurate to our 40,000 years of connection to country. Our people are the guardians as the recipients of our ancestors' knowledge and wisdom, whilst we practice the oldest living culture on earth with pride and passion. We also share the legacy of our most recent history with all Australians. We hope now, in a future not far from now, our shared history will be something to be celebrated like never before, and all our children grow speaking the first Australian languages and enjoying the beauty and diversity of Victoria's many First Peoples cultures. Together, we as Victorians must talk about this history and the many impacts of colonisation on our people. From a traditional owner perspective, support us to decolonise our country and homelands. So as First People, we can fulfil our rightful place as the owners and custodians of our culture, not just for our benefit, but for all people. I'm pleased at this point, Raquel, to mention that we launched the Taking Control of Our Heritage and so making a brilliant future for our children. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodney. I think it's really important to recognise that, particularly in the last, 20 years around, the cultural heritage scape, particularly in Victoria, it has progressed immensely to the point where we could almost, I say almost, claim bragging rights for the best, legislation in the country for cultural heritage and protection. So thanks for that, Rodney. Our next guest for this afternoon, I would like to introduce is Rachel Perkins, up on my second screen. So ensuring a national perspective with consideration of federal legislations. Please welcome Rachel, who is from the Arianti and Kalkadoon people, and absolute renowned filmmaker. I'm fangirling a little bit, so don't mind me. And a member of the Australian Heritage Council. So thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Raquel, and thanks very much, Rodney, for having me a part of this. I wanted to say that you definitely do have bragging rights, Victoria, and you should wear that with pride. And I wanted to pay tribute to you actually for achieving what we haven't been able to, get across the line in other jurisdictions. I think it's something really to be proud of, and I welcome your continual review of your act to really see that it's working in the interests of traditional owners. I congratulate you on that. I think I meant to talk about caring for country from my point of view. That's right, Raquel, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I thought I might talk in two halves, sort of what I do in my personal community, in my own community, and then sort of in the public sphere. So sort of on the personal front, my recent work is as an Aranda person, an Aranda woman, and over the last 5 years, we've been really giving attention to the intangible cultural heritage of our community, and in particular women's culture, Aranda women's culture, and its connection to our country, our lands, and our sites. Because I'm a woman, you know, I'll be talking just specifically about the women's stuff, but nothing sensitive or restricted, of course, in this public forum. So I've been working on our Alchira, which is Aranda word for our dreaming songs, or Awulya, which is women associated with women's songs. And we know that the continent was filled with songs, that songs were repositories of knowledge, and that songs were connected to our land, to features of our land. They depicted stories of the ancestors traveling across country, and many of the place names that we have in our many languages, 250 languages, refer to those ancestors and what they did in places and how they shaped our land and seas. And so we know that those song traditions which hold that knowledge about our land and our law are at risk in the process of colonisation. Much of that has been impacted. In Central Australia, in Alice Springs, Aranda, which is the centre of Aranda country, we had a desert between us and the colonial populations. And so it meant that our lands weren't really occupied until the late 1880s and 1890s, much later than other places. And so just that history has meant that some of our song traditions have remained intact. There's about 5,000 Aranda people, but only 1% of those are women who hold the song tradition. So it's very, very at risk. So in my role as sort of a filmmaker and as well as an Aranda person, I thought, well, what can I do about this with the women in my community? And together we initiated a project where we wanted to capture those songs and revitalise them. So with money from the Australia Council, Centre Corp, Screen NT and Screen Australia, with small grants, we held a women's camp. We did a couple of things. We went into the archives all around the country, found any recordings, of which there were very few, but some notable ones done by M.K. Turner and Jenny Green. We found all those archival recordings. We took those back to the descendants of the grandchildren and the daughters of the women who'd recorded those songs. We also got together and recorded everything they had in living memory, both dances and songs and body painting. And our next stage is to translate them, because often they're in an ancient form of Aranda, into English, so that people like me who don't speak Aranda as their first language can learn the meaning of the songs and learn them. And then we hope to link them to landscape. We didn't have the money to go and visit country, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll be able to do that. And so I suppose the reason we're doing that is to retain that intangible culture that is linked to our lands, and be able to pass it on to our granddaughters and nieces, to keep what we have left strong. So that's sort of the private sort of way that I interpret the question, caring for country. The country that I'm associated with on my mother's side, we have no native title for that. And so that has limitations, and the Land Rights Act in Northern Territory is expired as well, it's sunset clause. So we don't have any of that status, unfortunately, or access necessarily to our traditional country, but that's something that I feel like we need to deal with. In the public sphere, I'm one of two people alongside Linda Norman Parker, who's a Yawada man, Myself and he sit on what's called the Australian Heritage Council. The principal role of the Heritage Council is to advise the federal government on matters of heritage, and there's 4 other people on that council who specialise in historical heritage and natural heritage. And having those 3 things integrated is quite good because it means we can have an impact on those other areas of heritage. But we are responsible also for what's called the National Heritage List and the Commonwealth Heritage List. That was established, I think, in 2004. It took over from the National Estate. And so something that we've been involved with in recent times is working with the Heritage Councils of Australia and New Zealand. In 2019, Indigenous heritage chairs from all jurisdictions joined the Heritage Council of Australia and New Zealand. So Rodney sits with us around that table and all the other mainstream, if you like, heritage chairs. And it's a powerful group when we're joined together in unity. And in last year, all the Indigenous chairs met together to talk about issues of common concern. And it was a terrific meeting. And out of those, we've initiated a couple of projects. One is to look at heritage legislation across the country. So what we found is that, in New South Wales, for instance, their legislation is very outdated. And of course, we know from recent events that Western Australia is also way overdue for refreshing and renew. And we know that that's underway. So we looked at all the Indigenous heritage legislation, Victoria and Northern Territory being at the top in terms of the best, and Western Australia and New South Wales being at the bottom. And we said, okay, what are the standards Indigenous heritage should have across all jurisdictions to improve it? So with the help of Aboriginal Heritage Victoria and Matt Story, and through the process of the Indigenous chairs, we've drafted best practice standards. And there's 8 standards, which we expect all governments should take on as part of their management of Indigenous heritage. And I won't go into the detail of those now, but I can later. We're also initiating a vision for Indigenous heritage so that we can share that across the country, across the Federation of States and Territories, because we think that we should all be aiming towards, common goals for Indigenous heritage. And then we're also looking at how the Native Title Act interfaces with not only the EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Act, that is at a federal level, but also how it interacts with legislation in the states and territories. So that's 3 big projects that we're working on together with other chairs of Indigenous heritage across the country. And I think it's a really positive time because we have the nation's attention on what we have had to endure for decades, well, for the last 250 years in terms of inadequate protection of our culture and heritage. And so the nation's gaze is really focused on that. I think we will find that there will be improvements as a result of the great tragedy that happened in Western Australia. We have the review of the EPBC Act. His report is due this week, actually. So that's that's the 10-year cycle where we have a real opportunity to look at, okay, what can Indigenous, how can we improve the position of Indigenous heritage, not only nationally, but across the country at this time. So I'll probably leave it there and look forward to hearing from the others.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, particularly in regards to revisiting the EPBC and what is considered a minimum standard, or that should be considered as a minimum standard for protection for intangible and tangible heritage across the country. So it doesn't displace different levels of value amongst traditional owners in different states. I think why it's different is beyond me, but it's great that we are working towards that as we speak, which is incredible. So thanks, Rachel, for your introduction. All right, I'm going to jump across and hopefully not fall off the stage to my third screen, where I would like to introduce Hans Buckland. So Hans Buckland is a durable, tourable man from Queensland with a wealth of legislative experience at all levels of application. He is the inaugural director of the Aboriginal Melbourne branch in the city of Melbourne, and also the past president of Tawuri. Did I say that right? I hope I did.
Yes.
Which is the Indigenous Law Students and Lawyers Association of Victoria, which is fantastic for me as a budding law student. So welcome, Hans. Thank you for plugging into us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Rochelle, for having me here. And I'd like to say hello to Rachel and Rodney. Where I'm currently, I'm at home and I'm on Wurundjeri land, the Jurong people of Eastern Kulin Nations. I like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And it's just a privilege that no matter where we are, it's good for non-Indigenous people to do they realise or recognise, whose land they're currently sitting on at the moment. Rodney touched on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I thought, we're talking about legislative reforms, and just with regards to that particular document, I thought I just might read. And I think when you're talking about caring for country and legislative reform, I think very much so. We need a benchmark, a framework where we can engage in this particular space. And I thought I'd start by reading Article 31 of the Declaration. So it kind of puts, and I think this is what we should aspire to. I think, as already mentioned, Victoria's doing a fantastic job. I think it is a beacon in this space. But let's read it. It says, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literature, designs, sports and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. And then that's the segue to the next point of Article 31.2, where it says, in conjunction with Indigenous people, states shall take the effective measures to recognise and protect the exercise of these rights. So there's the starting point. And just coming back now to talking about my views on caring for country, I'll just go back to a saying that Aboriginal people are familiar with, and no doubt some other people are familiar with it as well. And the saying goes like this: if you look after the country will look after you. And that's one thing as an Aboriginal man myself, that reciprocal relationship we as human beings have with the land, with nature. And I think that's the concept when you think about caring for country should be understood. This integrated, sustainable approach, how we deal with our environment. And I don't want to go over what Rodney's already says, but even what Rachel mentioned too, because one thing I want to be clear on, when we talk about Aboriginal cultural property and intellectual property, they're connected. And there's Western concept, and they call it a bundle of rights, and they kind of break them out in different compartments. But from an Aboriginal perspective, we have a holistic approach. And I think that's where I see the exciting opportunities, particularly now I'm working at the City of Melbourne, where the application of caring for country can be used in an urban context, where it can offer new and innovative ways how we interact with nature and manage its resources for, be it economic, social, cultural prosperity. So it's fantastic that we can raise awareness about caring for culture in this public discourse, because we're talking about protecting our ecology. We're all aware of climate change and the impact that's having. So I think the principles that underpin caring for country provides a blueprint with these challenges, as I just mentioned, with regards to climate change. And they can help us to reshape how we value nature and its services in the urban form to ensure we continue to maintain a livable and sustainable Victoria in a dry and hotter future, because that's where we're heading. But what is it that we know? Traditional owner groups are endowed with an intrinsic system of customary laws, kinship systems, and totem relations that determine a system of resource management, which nourishes economic, environmental, cultural, spiritual, social, physical well-being. So caring for country conceives the land and its non-human inhabitants as deeply embedded in both the practical use of natural resources and the spiritual nourishment of society. And this interrelatedness, and it eliminates the demarcation we kind of think about, oh, that's the economy, that's looking at that sector, or the health sector, or the science sector, or the technology sector. Rather, caring for country, it looks at a holistic, fluid approach that's dependent on each other. And that's how Aboriginal people, as traditional owners of this land, fulfill their obligations to country. So we're talking about a holistic approach that emphasises that our cultural, environmental, economic, societal systems are not in opposition to one another, but they are necessary for the survival of each other. It also has applications to notions of ownership, because we've heard Rachel mentioned about native title. So even notions of ownership and resource use, where caring for country embodies an alternative view of ownership, and those conceptualized by Western legal institutions. Because ownership within the caring for country rubric represents a profound connection that goes hand to hand with stewardship, relationships of responsibility, and obligations to country, its human and non-human inhabitants. So from an Aboriginal perspective, it's a duty, not only to protect the land, but also to transfer traditional knowledge regarding the preservation of these relations to future generations. So caring for country is part of a network of relationships, just as like we think about human relationships and networking today, and we're kind of like in an unusual world at the moment where we've got COVID-19, we've got social isolation, and we can see the impact of that breaking down our social connections. So from a city perspective, I think there's an opportunity with regards to integrating caring for country principles into sustainable development, because at the moment I'm working on a task force and looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how Aboriginal caring for culture principles can flow into that. And as we know, the world's ecosystem is extremely complex, but it's facing terrible consequences, as a result of climate change, biodiversity loss, ecological degradation. So now's the time where we have an opportunity to integrate Aboriginal environmental philosophy and knowledge into the mainstream development practices. And as I mentioned, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it's on a global scale, there's an increasing recognition that what we're doing has to be another way. It's not working, this economic rationale. And that's where discussions have shifted, to an Indigenous, an Aboriginal perspective, because we've been managing the land for tens of thousands of years. And one thing about here in Australia, when it comes to Aboriginal culture, it's not static. We've dealt with colonisation. We're dealing with things, and it's fluid, it's adaptable. And that's one thing I think society can learn from Aboriginal principles of caring for country. So there's an excellent opportunity to take advantage of. One of the limitations I find when we think about this topic of caring for country, it's kind of like limited to be it national state parks or Indigenous protective areas, regional and remote Australia. But however, caring for country is just as important for Aboriginal Australians living in urban centres as it does apply to those living in remote areas, because caring for country is not exclusive to areas of the remote, but rather dreaming places are forever and everywhere. And Aboriginal people have a unique sense of landscape that includes the past, present and future, the physical, social, spiritual, and we're not disconnected through these processes just because of urbanisation. Because again, there's this stereotype thinking that, the typical Aboriginal person is the one living in the outback, away from the vices of economic development. But that type of thinking is actually quite dangerous, because it doesn't recognise the unique urban Aboriginal person who still has connections, strong connections to country. And so we've got this contemporary understanding of cultural heritage and how we're interacting with Western institutions. Because when you think about colonisation, who are the first ones to be impacted? The ones who are now in the cities. And we have to adapt. And so there's an opportunity here to still learn from the responsibilities that Aboriginal people are doing now, even in around the city of Melbourne. where we can see caring for country principles playing out in urban planning and sustainability practices, that it appreciates and respects the distinct histories and our cultural connectedness and expressions to the land where we live. So just summing up, just in my introductory comments, absolutely there's need for legislative reform. When I think about Western Australia, I worked over there for 9 years. We've got a piece of legislation was still dated 1972. The world's moved on from 1972. And so hence, so we need a uniform approach in this space. And I think underpinning Aboriginal caring for country is the cornerstone of sustainability going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the main messages I've taken from that is that Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal cultural heritage, caring for country really sums up through connection to country, and it's not exclusive. So it's not just, Aboriginal people trying to revive and revitalize and place us back in the landscape. It's also creating a connection for non-Aboriginal people who are living and, on country where they may not acknowledge the traditional owners, but creating that connection for them because it also forms part of their history as well. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. So thank you, Hans. And I'm going to scooch across to this side and not stand in front of everybody. My final guest for this afternoon is Jamie Lowe. From a national on-ground perspective, as a Gunditjmara Jurong man, Chief Executive Officer of the National Native Title Council and member of the Executive First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. Welcome. I'm hoping that we've all got, cool, everybody's back online. Fantastic. So welcome, Jamie.
Yeah, Najwa, Raquel, thanks for having me. You want me to just jump straight into it? Is that the plan?
Jump straight into it. Give us an introduction about, the work that you do, particularly around, National Native Title Council. What does caring to country mean for you?
I think from a personal perspective, I think that caring for country is crucial to our people. Protection of our cultural heritage is at the heart of our value system. Looking back in the rear vision mirror at our past, but also moving into the future, that protecting it for our young people, our grandchildren and our grandchildren's children, that they still have their heritage, that they can see that their ancestors participated in cultural practice is crucial. The Native Title Council, cultural heritage and native title are one of the same thing, and protection of cultural heritage is crucial to proving any native title determination from a technical perspective. I just want to kind of pick up on a couple of points that some of the other panelists have already made. That if we don't have heritage protection within law, we know that heritage simply isn't protected. And we've seen that within the Jurong Gorge incident in WA, where within the law that they have, and it was a good point made by Hans, 1972, some 50 years old. And unfortunately, we'd like to think that we've moved on and it's not 1972 anymore, but unfortunately for some individuals and that, we're still living in the past. So 1972 Act wasn't protected by law, and we see that something's gone funny with the camera there, but that's all right. That cultural heritage gets destroyed, and once it's destroyed, and that's on songlines, not only on that particular country, but at songlines. I just met with some of the traditional owners of WA today, and it's of songlines of people in the Kimberley, and it runs all the way down the south to the Noongar people. So it's not only destroying the peoples, the traditional owners' cultural heritage, it's destroying cultural heritage for other traditional owners in other parts of the state of WA and also in other states as well. And then we shift over to the state of Victoria, who we talk about being the kind of, the high watermark and the platinum version of cultural heritage protection. And unfortunately, that it doesn't go far enough to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage in the state of Victoria either. So we have incidents like in Victoria within Garryword National Park, where rock climbers are still climbing on rock art, which is thousands of years old, and it's not actually protected by law within our law system within Victoria or within the Commonwealth. So we're still seeing even the best example of cultural heritage protection in the state of Victoria are still allowing for cultural heritage to be destroyed. And as I say, once it's destroyed and once it's gone, we can't get it back. And I've been reflecting on this quite a bit over the last month about why do we kind of continue to destroy Aboriginal cultural heritage? We have narratives like, Aboriginal heritage is Australia's heritage, so it's all our heritage. So I just think that why are we going out there and destroying 40,000-year-old sites? So, well, it says to me that Aboriginal heritage isn't Australia's heritage, or otherwise other people would protect it as we want it to be protected, if that makes sense. So, like, someone wouldn't go and destroy their own house because something that they grew up in, they've got memories there, whether it be for 1 or 2 generations. They just wouldn't do it because it's within their value system. It's something that they hold true to them. It's got memories there. They just wouldn't do it. So you can see there where Aboriginal cultural heritage in our value system isn't necessarily lining up with Australia's wide kind of value system. There's a misfire there, and there needs to be a process of actually kind of, I guess, understanding. I know last week within the First Peoples Assembly, we committed to a truth-telling and justice process here in the state of Victoria. And maybe that can go part of the way to actually kind of, protecting cultural heritage more. But I guess I want to make another point as well. If we're also not recognising traditional owners within different jurisdictions, because we're the custodians of country, and if we're not recognised as the custodians of country, we can't protect our country. It becomes more difficult to protect it. So we need to have a process of also recognising Aboriginal traditional owners as custodians, and whether that be through, I know Victoria's got legislation through Registered Aboriginal Parties, Traditional Owner Settlement Act, Native Title Act, and now we're embarking on treaty making. So I do call upon the federal government to start embarking on a truth telling, but also a treaty making process for the country to protect our cultural heritage. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of my head kind of thinks it's due to a lack of, understanding, education, and being able to connect to, the systems that we have as Aboriginal people. But we've been talking about this for a very long time, like before I was born, and, just as my dad was coming into the world, 1972, by the way, sorry, Dad. But really just highlighting, we have been doing this for a while, and that's why discussions like this, like today, are so invaluable, because we're going to be able to reach to a wider audience. And I think with the help of media and social platforms, particularly, with the younger generations being able to share and, advertise and advocate for things so quickly, we'll be able, hopefully, to start seeing those changes as a voice of the majority within legislation. So thanks for that, Jamie. Alrighty, so moving on to our deep dive questions. I have a couple of specific questions for our panelists, so I'm going to jump back over this side and start with Rodney. Are you all good? Fantastic.
I'm unmuted this time, so I might be better at it.
That's completely fine. So, Rodney, you've often talked about negotiating the Jurong People's Recognition and Settlement Agreement, which was a part of the Traditional Owner Settlement Act 2010 as a defining moment for you. For our viewers, the Traditional Owner Settlement Act was an alternative process to native title, which allowed traditional owner groups to go down through a different recognition process and enter into negotiations with the state for a settlement that, keeps consistent negotiations between traditional owners and the state, and looks at things like self-determination, natural resource and management. So obviously, with that being a defining moment for you in Jurong, what does it mean to you to care for country and to protect cultural heritage through, that process?
I think Hans touched on something really interesting before about the importance of us as First People, and I think as we try and go forward to Australia, define identity as Australian, as I say, a real country, our connection to the real world is really, really important. So I think in everything that we do as leaders and trying to reclaim our rights, activate our rights, it's the human nature of how we can turn that type of thinking, Raquel, to connection to the world, and that's different for all people, all cultural groups. Just touching what I thought was the most significant thing about our settlement agreement for our people was our ability to compromise. And I don't think the state coming to us as First People and wanting us to exert our rights, they didn't necessarily compromise. They were prepared at that point in time, and relationships hopefully develop and flourish and get better. But at that point in time, they were only prepared to give so much or to share so much as the holder of all that was rightfully our ancestors, and it should have been our inheritance today. They're only prepared at that point in time to share so much. So what I find is absolutely brilliant then is our people's ability to compromise and understand that as old as our culture is, over 40,000 years, we're able to think, well, we're still going to be here in another 40,000 years. So let's give people the opportunity to realise actually how brilliant we can be. So for me, that was sort of defining. It was brilliant, and it afforded us, and I think we're very humble, as the opportunity actually to show other people, if we're afforded our rights recognition, and we have to do developmental things, foundational things as a First People to translate to modern world activities, if we're given that time and the support, we actually can live up to these unbelieved expectations, I think, because largely people think that we will fail, and that's based on their oppression of us as a people. So I'm pretty excited.
That's definitely one way to put it. Excited. I'm very excited. Slightly nervous, but excited because it's going to be a very different change for everybody. But also moving across to, the creation of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. So this is speaking once again a bit before my time. You would have seen the development of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act, which was created in and implemented in 2007. My page wouldn't turn, I'm sorry. So what protections are in place for, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act? Are they effective in helping us care for country?
That's a question for me?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. I think one of the uniqueness of the current Victorian legislation, and it was in the Commonwealth Act as seen as Part 2A, where there was a division that related directly to Victoria. That came about basically for our advocacy as Victorian First People. So if you look at then at the current Act, the way that it's structured to afford a statutory function to Aboriginal corporations, as we understand they're registered Aboriginal parties, I think that in itself is quite brilliant. It just starts that idea practically around rights recognition and involvement. A sad fact of acts and regulations is they ultimately try and define what is our motives, our behaviour, and what are the constraints and the legislative world, the legal world that we work in. So when I say that we've got a good act, and Jamie's just touched on something so ironic before around the rock art, the Act's part of its purpose affords tenure blind, the protection of Aboriginal culture in Victoria, and then we see the destruction of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So, the purpose of the Act is true, it's pure, it's right, but then how you practically apply acts and then the regulation. And that's where the challenge comes. But at this point in time, I think, and it's a capability thing, and I touched on it before, the development and the foundational work that First People need to do to get skin in the game and work in this space. That's a really good opportunity for us, and it's a challenge. But I think what we've seen over the last decade, we are up to it, and we're so honourable as people that we're not just doing it for our children yet to be born. We're visionary enough to see that will help Australia, Victoria, get a real identity. It'll throw away, hopefully, the shackles of empire, and will dismiss those that still hold on to power, that really don't appreciate. They're really just puppets in what they've partially inherited from colonisation. Going forward, we'll define our future, and I reckon we empower our children to be able to do that, because they won't have, hopefully, bad learnt behaviours.
Fingers crossed that is the case. And I think, to put some figures to, cultural heritage and protection on ground, I think the last stats that came out was that it's about 6% of the Victoria state that was surveyed, with over, I think it was 47,000 registered Aboriginal places for the state of Victoria, with only 6% surveyed. So in context, what does that mean for the rest of the state that hasn't been surveyed as of yet? And, Rodney's touched on it and Jamie's touched on it as well, the need to be able to protect those sites, as opposed to letting loopholes within legislation, allowing them to be destroyed. So thank you for that, Rodney. Rachel, your turn now. Fantastic. So you've undertaken such important cultural resurgence initiatives in your own country, including the recording of traditional women's songs, publishing of audio language resources. Culture is clearly a fundamental part of your life. So what does it mean to you to protect that, and obviously connecting that into caring for country and, for heritage? You may be on mute also, by the way.
Thank you. Sorry. Well, like many of our people, culture is really central to our well-being. I mean, there's lots of evidence that talks about that now, and lots of studies that support that. And because our identity is, in part drawn, well, in large part is drawn from our connection to country, as well as our traditions. Those things are central to me. And I think, I've had those traditions interrupted, in my father was born in a native institution. I went back home when I was 18 with a mission to try and connect better and see what I could do. But yeah, so I mean, on a personal level, they're absolutely profoundly central to who I am. But I take the opportunity to talk less about me and more about our best practice standards in legislation?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Sponsor's yours.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Well, I just wanted to talk through these 8 points, because when all of these Indigenous heritage people sat around the table together and then over the phone, we came up with these principles, as I said, with the help from the leadership from Aboriginal Heritage Victoria, and we came up with these 8 points. I'll just smash through them. One is that the definitions in legislation recognise that Indigenous cultural heritage is in fact a living concept. Often people think it's something that is pre-1788, or they determine the culture, whether we can connect to something that's 40,000 years old and we still understand those connections. We want to emphasise that cultural heritage changes and it's connected to people today. The second point is that the legislation is structured so that it provides a blanket protection for Indigenous cultural heritage, subject only to authorisations granted with the consent of affected Indigenous people. So that means that, we rather than saying, oh, this becomes an Indigenous heritage site through sort of ministerial approval, the legislation is flipped so that all Indigenous heritage is protected as a foundation of the legislation. In many jurisdictions, that's not the case. Obviously, traditional owners need to be central to the process, and point 3 talks about that we need to work through a system of either having registered Aboriginal parties, as you do in Victoria, or native title groups, PBCs, or through land councils, but you have to deal with legitimate traditional owners in negotiating Indigenous heritage. Point 4 talks about that you have to engage early, that often Indigenous heritage issues are left to the last minute. So what we're saying in terms of the best practice standards is that needs to be brought right into the beginning of the process. That when you do bring Indigenous communities into the process, number 5 of the best practice standards talk about that needs to be resourced. It's part of the statutory obligations often of the government, and that needs to be seen as a legitimate part of the process that's equally resourced with other elements. Point 6 asks that we want, the enforcement regimes to be effective and broadly uniform. In some places, like in Western Australia, the fines are less for damaging Indigenous heritage than they are for non-Indigenous heritage. And, we just want it to have a uniform process across the country where we're all brought up to these high benchmarks. Number 7 deals with our ancestral remains, our old people, that those things and sacred objects are seen as the traditional owners are the primacy. We recognise the primacy of their relationships to those ancestors or objects, rather than them being seen as items that are held in collections. We want that recognition of them as our things to be acknowledged and our responsibility to those items. And then also frontier conflicts, the recognition of frontier conflict sites, that the recognition of those places which we're seeing haven't been recognised widely, which is why we prioritise that when they are recognised, and which should happen more, that Indigenous people who are the descendants or traditional holders or native title holders of those regions are engaged in that process early. So that's just what, that's the best practice standards. That's the sort of 8 points that we sort of whittled it down to, that we think all legislation should adhere to across all jurisdictions.
Oh, 100%. I think for a lot of people who work within the industry, they see it as common sense. Going, this
Yes.
is something we should be doing as a minimum, but not always the case. Do you think that being able to recommend these best practices across the country, do you think that there will be difficulty in being able to, like, for people who do not understand the concept of cultural heritage, to be able to support it and to implement it?
Well, I think generally what we've found working with the jurisdictions is that the officials, what we call them, the bureaucrats, they're often supporters of Indigenous heritage, and they're limited by these outdated acts in which they work, and they want them changed, but they haven't been able to get the political willpower to change them. But I think the focus on what's happened in Western Australia has really made people look in their, backyards and think, well, what are we doing? What's the problem with our legislation? Could this happen here? And, we know that it has happened in other jurisdictions. So I think there's a big focus on that. And I think particularly with the EPBC Act, which is also being reviewed, there's a few things that we want there. One is that we want intangible heritage to be recognised. We want ancestral remains to come out of the Movable Heritage Act and be put in the EPBC Act, because our ancestors' remains aren't just these movable, items. Of course, we want in consultation with Indigenous people. And also one other thing that makes a real problem for us is this single listing thing. Like when you want to put something on the National Heritage List, you can only put like a thing that's got a continuous boundary, often one thing. So like with a songline, it's really hard to list it, because you might have, a site at a hill, and then 30 kilometres, you've got another place, and another place further down, right across the country, without a continuous boundary or a continuous line. So we want serial listing adopted as well as part of the EPBC review. So those are a couple of things that, we feel like as Indigenous people representing the interests of our mob, that's what we'd like to see changed in legislation. And of course, native title, bringing together the Native Title Act and the EPBC Act.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes without saying as well, intangible heritage places and solidifies the physical and the tangible heritage that is on the ground. You know, you can listen to all the songlines and the stories, and then when you're out on country, you can see where it links up and where everything is connected, which is an absolutely incredible thing if you ever get a chance to do so. So thank you for that, Rachel. And duck across this side of the stage again. I feel like I'm running everywhere. I'm getting my steps up. So, Hans, obviously is the director of Aboriginal Melbourne branch at City of Melbourne. You know, accepting the call to revitalise the City of Melbourne's relationships with Aboriginal community members and to cement Aboriginal Melbourne as a benchmark par excellence. You must have a strong sense of importance of culture to community and well-being. So what does that mean for you within the role that you have?
Thank you. And just putting things into context, it's already been mentioned, we're dealing with the oldest continuous living culture in the world. So absolutely from the get-go, it needs to be managed and protected. And Aboriginal people, Aboriginal groups have to be at the forefront of that. I mentioned in my introductory comments about I see opportunity here when you think about caring for country and legislative reforms. Like I'll give an example at the City of Melbourne. We have the urban forest strategy that considers climate change by providing a robust framework for the longevity of Melbourne's urban forest. So here in this context, there's an opportunity for Aboriginal community engagement and consultation and with the City of Melbourne's urban forest strategy, you know, which is in keeping, and just using another piece of legislation, Part 6 of the Natural Resource Agreements of the Traditional Owner Settlement Act 2010. And just thinking too, with regards to climate change, and we can just think we're currently dealing with COVID, but we just recently had bushfires and the impact that had across not just Victoria, New South Wales, but the rest of the country. And there's an opportunity for cultural burning. You know, so here we're talking about caring for country. And when we think about cultural burning or traditional burning as performed by Aboriginal people as part of, you know, our cultural responsibilities and obligations to care for country. And a part of cultural burning, people might have heard the expressions bandied around cool burning. You know, this is an Aboriginal method of managing country through early dry season cool burning. And this has been shown to dramatically reduce the incidence and intensity of hot fires in the dry season. So cool burning reduces the amount of damage done by hot fires to ecosystems by providing new plant growth, clearing natural waste materials by reducing what they call fuel loads. And it's interesting, here in Victoria, the Country Fire Authority recognises that cultural burning can assist Victorians with the uncertainties of a changing climate, where knowledge sharing can assist in an adaptive framework of fire management practices, where they've got the Victorian traditional owner cultural fire strategy. So here's an opportunity now, so not just to manage and protect, but sharing that knowledge, using a natural resource, Aboriginal cultural heritage in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the term Aboriginal cultural heritage is not just specific to archaeological sites. It's a broad spectrum in, you know, cultural practice, cultural revitalisation, particularly where you've mentioned the comment around cultural burns, particularly up on Jurong country. Jurong traditional owners are cultural burning on country on Parks Estate in joint with Delp and Parks Victoria, which it has been absolutely incredible. So my next question for you, after nearly a decade, wow, that's amazing. As a CEO of a major traditional owner corporation, which is the Goldfields Land and Sea Council, on ground of cultural heritage implementation has been vital. And I know that within your introduction, you mentioned bits and pieces of this as well, but it still doesn't hurt to repeat it, which is fantastic, because I think there has been a real big common theme here about continuation of the oldest living culture in the world. What current legislative protections are in place, and how are they effective in your point of view in caring for country?
here in Australia, we have a complex set of laws governing, the overall cultural heritage, at a federal level, then at individual state and territory levels. And I think when you think about using the context of the, at a federal level, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protection Act, 1984, that piece of legislation was implemented as a safety net. And I'm just using that specifically, that terminology, a safety net, because inherent, when you think about a safety net, there's a recognition that the state legislation, territory legislation, has inherent deficiencies in it. Hence why you need this safety net. So this understanding that, and I might use a technical term for everyone here, can we not stop mucking around in this space on the fringes? We need to build a robust system from the ground up, that genuinely promotes and protects Aboriginal cultural heritage. And I go back to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and this the principle of free, prior, informed consent. But intrinsic in that is that concept of self-determination, how important it is through this whole process of caring for country, be it legislative reform, self-determination in that process. Because one thing about the concept of Aboriginal cultural heritage, we're talking about a holistic acknowledgement. How Aboriginal people deal with, as already mentioned before, the tangible and intangibles. We're talking about song lines, we're talking about stories, dance, art, all those things, but also sites, locations, objects that have specific spiritual significance, and we need to that needs to be protected. And at the moment, at a Commonwealth level, there isn't any protection of intangible aspects as a part of that Commonwealth piece of legislation that I mentioned before, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Protection Act. And one of the flaws in that particular piece of legislation is Aboriginal parties have to apply. There's a processor going up there, and it's discretionary. And this is the whole process. So straight away, self-determination is taken away from traditional owners, and that's where it's got to change. And that's where I think the Northern Territory model, I think with regards to what Victoria has done with the amendments to the Aboriginal Heritage Act with regards to recognising and registering intangible aspects. And I hope that's a bugle call to arms, so to speak, as impetus that we can have further discussions where the rest of the state and territory pick up on what Victoria is doing across here. But just with regards to the Northern Territory, because one thing that they have they've established an Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. And it's interesting with regards to what that allows them to do. They have the responsibility of administering the sacred sites legislation, but also it talks about exclusive power to prosecute. So that body, as an Aboriginal body, has the exclusive power to prosecute offences under the Act. And so when it comes to the minister, he only has a limited capacity to intervene when this particular body makes a decision. But around the state, around the country, it's the reverse. Everything's kind of vested in the minister. And I go back to the Western Australian situation. A piece of legislation, 1972, under Section 17, it's an offence, to desecrate a particular site, not object. But there's a Section 18 application, and one of the deficiencies, and particularly with Section 18 application, is Aboriginal people, they don't have the right to appeal a part of this process. Proponents, if the minister goes in favour of the Aboriginal party, the proponent can appeal, but Aboriginal people can't appeal. So just there's a flaw in that. Where's the justice? So I think there's an opportunity now, and I think about the principles that Rachel was alluding to, there's an opportunity to do something in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this reminds me of a conversation that I had with the New South Wales Heritage Council late last year while they were looking at their New South Wales cultural heritage reform. And, a question was raised going, how is the best way that we deal, and what's the best way to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage? Auntie Sissy Pettit was with me as well, and we both laughed and said, you need to give the power of decision-making back to traditional owners. They are best placed within this space to determine, protection measures, or even right to veto, which I think is really, really important. Particularly within the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act, we don't have that quite yet. We can argue that, sites are really significant. Scientifically, they may be of low value, but to us, they're quite imperative, but we still have to mitigate that harm, or we have to, what is the cost of protecting or learning from cultural heritage if it's only via destruction at this point? Yes, I completely understand. Thank you for that, Hans. Lucky last, Jamie, are you ready? Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
I can now. Fantastic. Yeah. Perfect. So, you've been working with traditional owners over, the recent Jurong Gorge destruction, which, conveniently kick-started off Reconciliation Week. Congratulations, everybody. Has this affected what caring for country and protecting cultural heritage means for you?
It doesn't I guess the Jurong Gorge incident is just something that made the front page of the newspaper for mine. Before my role at the NNTC, I was the CEO of our PBC down in the southwest end of Victoria, and talking to other traditional owner groups and other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people throughout the country. Like this is a daily occurrence, and albeit the significance of the site, 46,000 years old. So it just kind of reinforced something that I already knew, which was going on. And I think that there's been some really good points made on the panel so far. I think Hans' kind of point of self-determination and actually what that actually looks like, and being able to determine what actually happens on your country, rather than kind of, there's a term that I really hate around kind of, you're a stakeholder. Aboriginal people, traditional owner people aren't stakeholders. We're the traditional custodians of this country, which we've preserved for 60,000, 80,000, 100,000 years. So, that needs to be recognised through this process. And we're an expert of kind of caring for country even into the future. And Hans also talked on the fire practice, which is kind of being looked at more closely, particularly with the recent fires that took place within Australia, only a couple of months ago, which we've all forgotten about, I guess, because we're all on COVID mode at the moment. So this is, and it just gets back to the points earlier, kind of we need to kind of have law reform to protect our cultural heritage. Otherwise, if it's not protected, it won't be protected. We can't trust in other people, not traditional owner, not Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, to protect our culture, because it just doesn't happen. I think one of the points that Rachel made around the kind of the standards and kind of flipping it a little bit, because at the moment it's kind of all land's up for grabs unless it's not. We need to kind of flip that conversation that all land's sacred to our people and all has a cultural heritage value until we say that you can have access to industry. And I think there's a myth out there that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are kind of, if there's kind of this veto right, or there's greater protection put on cultural heritage, all of a sudden, people won't be able to build houses, they won't be able to build roads, they won't be able to mine and whatnot. When we know where the strongest legislative, I guess, law is in place, land rights, etc., that things still happen on those countries. Things still happen, so life still goes on. I remember, I don't quite remember, but I remember people talking about it, because I was only a young fella back in the early 90s when native title first was a thing, and everyone thought that their backyards were going to get taken and etc. And we know that didn't happen. So we just need to kind of do a bit of myth busting here as well through this process. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage protection doesn't mean tools down and no one can do anything, and Australia is shut down for business. So that needs to be cut through as well. And I think industry and kind of broader kind of stakeholders need to understand that as a principle. But if there is a situation where there is a veto opportunity where, you know, that site is sacred to us, we just need to kind of recognise and value that's a thing. I think here in the state of Victoria, our next process with the treaty making process that we're in at the moment will be a conversation about what's on the table, what's off the table. I would imagine that cultural heritage and its protection will be up the front of the list somewhere, and us giving a true self-determining right to protect our own country and in our own jurisdiction. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
It actually answered 3 of my questions that I had for you, so you did an amazing job. Funnily enough, about the native title stuff, like, you know, in 1992, it was handed down. I was born that year. But I was talking with a youth council last night in regards to media fear tactics around, you know, what did it actually mean around Aboriginal people being able to exercise a form of self-determination and recognition through, you know, native title. And then when we turn our views to Victoria, because we were so colonised as part of that process, being able to achieve, you know, native title status through that process is like ridiculously hard, because everyone was moved off country to missions and to, you know, through adoption and processes like that, which, you know, creates a lot of hurt for our people. I think one thing you've also mentioned is around the harm and the destruction of cultural heritage. Obviously in Victoria there are, you know, compliance measures in place for harm of Aboriginal cultural heritage. Which has space for knowingly destroying cultural heritage, doing it via negligence, or just being completely reckless. I would like to pick your brain on what you would see strengthened around compliance and how it could be applied to, you know, the rest of the country.
Well, I'll give you an example of how the Victorian process works. So if there is if there is an act where cultural heritage is by accident or on purpose destroyed, we had an incident on my country where a scarred tree was cut down close to a lake, and there was a government department that did it, and so then the government department, or a government department, actually does the investigation to the incident, and if there is found to be any negligence and there is a fine, the money or the fine actually goes back to Treasury. So the government commits the act, the government does the investigation, and the government gets the money if there's any breach kind of or negligence found. So that doesn't pass any test, doesn't pass the pub test, doesn't pass any test at all. If you're kind of speaking to anyone about that, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal people, they just kind of go, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's like me getting caught speeding and then I pay the fine goes into my bank account. So that's a thing, and that's across the board. And I also just kind of wanted to kind of loop back to the point about a kind of a values based system and recognising values of other cultures within Australia, and in this case, obviously our culture, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture. I also sit in the Victorian Heritage Council, and we get applications to have heritage registrations on a weekly basis. And, we meet today, although virtually on Federation Square, which is how old? About 20 years, maybe, give or take. And there's an application to protect that under the Victorian Cultural Heritage legislation. So we're talking about something that's going to be protected or potentially protected that's 20 years old, because people value it and they see it as part of their makeup, I guess, that they've been visiting, and they see it as an important part to Melbourne culture, etc. We're talking about sites that are at a minimum, 1,000 years, 2,000 years old. So surely that kind of equation kind of needs to kind of resonate with, the people that are tuning in today. And maybe we're kind of preaching to the converted as we do. But that kind of imbalance there we need to kind of just kind of sit back and have a think about that for a little bit, I think, maybe as a closing point for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the treaty process, which you are a part of, will heavily influence a lot of those issues that we're facing around managing cultural heritage as well. So that is, I think, it's something that I personally am looking forward um, to watching unfold as this progresses. So we're nearing the end of our discussion this afternoon, and I'd just like to ask our panel members if you had any other closing remarks, motivations, advice to our many, many viewers that are streaming in before we close our discussion off today. Whoever would like to stick their hand up? Yep, Hans, go for it. I think you're on mute again too.
Just
Perfect.
with regards to still today, it's 2020, and the Australian legal framework still limits the ability of Aboriginal people to adequately protect their cultural and intellectual property from exploitation by outsiders. Because one thing about, and I'll use a different phrase now, Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights encompasses ecological knowledge of biodiversity, medicinal knowledge, environmental management, knowledge and cultural, spiritual knowledge and practices. So what we need to see happening in this space is a uniform piece of legislation across Australia that looks, and from a federal level down, that looks at Aboriginal tangible and intangible rights and interests. Otherwise, we'll continue to see destruction and misappropriation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So it needs protection, because certain things is piecemeal legislation throughout the country. We've even got copyright law in this space. So it needs protection, not just at an individual level, but also protected at a communal level. Now, why is this important? Because we're dealing with the oldest continuous living culture in the world. So let's protect it, let's learn from it. So whether Aboriginal or not, there's truth in the statement, if you look after the country will look after you.
Absolutely. Healthy country equals healthy people. I think that is a very broad term to put it. Did we have any other closing remarks from our panelists this afternoon?
I think that I'd like to say this kind of message to the governments out there, it's our human right to be able to protect our cultural heritage, and it shouldn't be a kind of political contentious point for us to be able to do that as a fundamental principle. Australia signed up to the to UNDRIP, Declaration for Indigenous People. We need to action it, we need to recognise it, and we need to get on with it. So enough of the kind of politics, I think, and we just need to get on with it. That's kind of my closing point.
Thanks for that, Jamie. Rachel, I think you had unmuted just at the same time.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that's been said, and UNDRIP is very important. Free, prior, informed consent is obviously underpins all of our frameworks. But can I just also put a plug in for people trying to protect their places, that the National Heritage List, it doesn't have as many Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander places on it that it should. We are trying to proactively seek more places to be recognised for their national significance. It does give a very high quality of protection to Indigenous places, as it does to all places that are on the list. And also the other great aspect of being on the National Heritage List, not only is it the status that it's afforded to it, but also it makes it eligible for the Australian Heritage Grants, which is a Commonwealth initiative of $5 million a year that's given to places that are on the list. So one of the first places that was put on the heritage list was Budgebim, which we know was congratulations to Goodnich Mara, Eastern Mar community for getting that on the list first for its Indigenous values, and now it's just been listed on the World Heritage List for its Indigenous values. It's the only place that's on the World Heritage List for its Indigenous values alone. So great leadership again from Victoria. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of let people know that that opportunity is there for people who are wanting to protect their places.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Rachel. Rodney, do you have any closing remarks before I start reading out my conclusion?
I think I talk too much, Raquel, but just wanted to thank the panel, Rachel, Hans and Jamie and yourself, Raquel, for hosting this evening. I think, as I mentioned this afternoon, First People are actually up to this, and if we're given the freedom we actually deserve to be able to define our future, I would suggest, for the benefit of just not our people, but everyone, will do the right thing. When heritage is destroyed, largely it's irreplaceable. So we can't afford for what remnants largely across landscape that we've got to allow the destruction. I honestly believe that there's degrees of behavioural problems, learnt behaviours, and I think the goodness of people, if they allow children for them to be empowered and to find their future, where they're more caring, they're more understanding. We've touched on this, connected to the environment, walking the streets, speaking the First Peoples of this country's language, that it's embedded everywhere, that Australia actually reclaims its identity. I think that's the end game for all of us. So it's really up to those that have enjoyed the opportunity to hear from us today. I don't think we're lecturing to people, we're sharing, and that's a really good thing to do. Hopefully people take away a positive message and share it with others and really try to be constructive. We've got to do things. It's okay to vent and be frustrated, and I think that's a form of normal behaviour, but ultimately we've all got to do something, and leaders have got to step up and be held accountable. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Rodney. I think, so with all the discussions that have been had today, there is a jar of phrase that comes to mind, which is Watarakin Mangek Nyolek Matok, which means that we come with purpose and we speak our truth and we speak it with strength. And that is what all of our panelists have done here today. So thank you. Caring for country is not a new concept to our mob. But caring for country through legislation is a relatively imposed modern dynamic. The ways in which we work together as Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people is essential to administrative of the Act, of its intention to give traditional owners the statutory control to manage and make the best decisions on their country for them to revitalise their culture, to place themselves back in the landscape that a lot of people, unfortunately, were removed from at colonisation. The intention should be fulfilled by the Act in itself, the incorporation of our rights, referencing the United Declarations of Indigenous Peoples, and how we can implement that as a fundamental basis within our lives, regardless whether we are Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal. As you have heard this afternoon, the Act in Victoria is strong, but not without its flaws, not without its mistakes. And I'm pretty sure if we did a comparative list of all the state legislation across Australia of mistakes outweighing the good, we'd have a very long list, which means that we have a very long way to go. So to continue this conversation, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, the council I've been really, really lucky to be a part of, has released a discussion paper which looks at the legislative review of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act. You can find this online at www.victorianaboriginalheritagecouncil.com.au. If you can't remember the really long web address, look us up on Facebook. There'll be plugs through Facebook, through Instagram, and it's open for comment, it's open for revision. Any questions, direct them straight through to the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council and we'll deal with them the best that we can. Once again, thank you to all of our panelists. Really enjoyed talking to you all. And thank you to all of our viewers streaming online, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Is that it?
I think that's it. Cool. I don't want to hear my voice through a speaker again.
Thank you, everybody. Congratulations. Oh, we've had people jump out. Well done. Well done.